All right. So, hello to you and to anyone who's watching. I'm going to be having a discussion with David Friedman. He's an economist. He has quite an impressive resume. And we're going to be discussing anarchy and potentially other big ideas. Right. So, in terms of anarchy, there are a couple of arguments that I have against anarchy as to why I don't think anarchy would be the optimal system of government. I think that you generally agree that market failures are certainly a problem for anarchy. Things like pollution, insufficient funding of the military, etc. Now, the question is just, are they sufficiently large of a problem to justify maintaining a state given its inefficiency? And I don't see how that question of whether its inefficiency is greater than the inefficiency of, or rather, the inefficiency of not regulating market failures is greater than the inefficiency of just inherent in government action. It seems like that's only resolvable by looking, that seems like only an empirical question. Do you think that there's a way that that can be resolved theoretically, absent examining empirics? Oh, wait, I have to add you. Oh, whoops.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Okay. Whoops. I didn't add you to the stream. That was my bad. Okay.
I don't think it can be resolved with certainty, theoretically. In economics in general, my view of the way you do economics is you form plausible conjectures on theoretical grounds, and you then see what implications they have and try to test those implications. I think there is a general argument which suggests an answer to your question, but it does no more than suggest it. And that argument is that if you think about the cause of market failure, that I think of market failure in general as situations where individual rationality does not produce group rationality, where if each person correctly does what's in his own interest, the result is not what is in the interest of everybody. Indeed, may not be what in the interest of anybody. And I have multiple examples I could give, but there's no particular reason to do them here. This ultimately comes from situations where someone is making a decision where he either is not bearing most of the cost or is not receiving most of the benefit. So if I'm making a decision where I receive all the benefit but bear only a fraction of the cost, my benefit may be larger than my cost, so I make the decision, even though the total benefit, including effects on others, is less than the cost. Similarly, if I bear the cost but don't receive the benefit, or don't receive very much of the benefit, it may not pay me to take the action even though benefit is larger than cost. That's the basic market failure problem. It's not about markets. I think the term is misleading in that sense because it exists in lots of contexts other than markets. Two of my standard examples are why an army runs away, because each soldier is better off running, even though the army as a whole is better off if none of them run, and why restaurants are noisy, because it pays me to raise my voice so the other people at the table can hear me, but everybody does that. It gets louder and louder. Those are my standard examples. If you think about that condition, on an ordinary private market, normally each actor is bearing the costs and receiving the benefits of his actions. That if I want to produce something, I've got to pay the other people who provide my output enough so they're willing to provide my inputs enough so they're willing to provide those inputs. So I've got to make them better off, or at least as well off as if I was not doing it. I get from the people who buy my output something that represents the value to them. It's not a perfect system, but at least a first approximation. Each actor is getting the benefit, bearing the costs. Therefore, his net benefit is about equal to the total net benefit. Therefore, he'll make the right decisions. He'll do things that are worth doing and not things that are not worth doing. And the full-blown version of that, I usually say, takes a semester or two of price theory. I can recommend my book, Hidden Order, for people who want to learn it for themselves without a university. But what I gave is at least a sketch of it. Now, that breaks down in various situations. So the pollution is a standard example. I'm running a steel factory. I've got to pay my workers, I've got to pay for my ore, I got to pay for my coal, but I don't have to pay for the effect of my emissions on the people downwind from me. So that's a case where I might produce steel when it's not worth producing, or I might produce steel in a way that produces a lot of pollution when at a small cost I could produce it in a way that produces less pollution, use low sulfur coal instead of high sulfur coal, say. So that's why sometimes the market gives the wrong answer. But if you compare the market to the political system, on the market, what I'm describing is the exception. On the political system, it's the rule. That in the political system, hardly any actor either bears the cost or receives the benefit of his action. It's only a slight exaggeration, so it's just pure luck if they do the right thing. That if you think at the base of the system are voters, individual voters, in order to control the system to make government do good things, individual voters have to be well informed, both about what the government is doing, what individual politicians are doing that contributes to it, what it ought to be doing. That's not costless or even easy stuff to know. The people who they're observing have a very strong incentive to conceal anything that they're doing that is not attractive, that no politician in my experience runs as the bad guy. My standard example is that as far as I know, nobody has ever introduced a bill to the US Congress labeled a bill to make farmers richer and city folk poor. Every year they pass such a bill. They call it the farm program. Generally, the details vary, but basically it's designed to raise the price of food in order to raise the income of farmers. But that's not immediately obvious. So that means that voters are rationally ignorant, so you can't rely on democracy to make government do the right thing. Lobbyists are trying to get laws that benefit their group at the expense of many other people. They don't bear that expense. So if you try to think through the logic of the political system, which is what basically public choice theory is about, it looks as though the source of market failure is a normal pattern on the political system. The only puzzle is why it doesn't work even worse than it does. Whereas it's a special case on the economic. So that's why it seems to me there is a general presumption that market failure is going to be more of a problem with the political system, but it's not a proof. And if you really believe what could well be the case for some societies, that if you don't have a government, you won't be able to produce enough national defense to keep an aggressive neighbor from annexing you, doesn't do a whole lot of good to abolish your government as a result if you get somebody else's. So it's the claim I've made. I mean, in general, there are really two different issues, which you're really combining, but I usually separate. One of them is the system stable? If you set up the system I described, will you still have it 10 years or 20 years or 30 years later? The other is, if you do have it, will it produce desirable outcomes? So market failure with regard to national defense is really a stability problem. And the other stability problem we can talk about, if you like, is the threat of cartelization, the threat that your rights enforcement agencies will decide it's more profitable to reinvent government than to do what they're supposed to do. But the other problem, so those are, I think, the two stability problems. And the other problem is situations where the market that's producing law will produce the wrong legal rules. And those are market failure situations, what I described as market failure on the market for law in the third edition of Machinery of Freedom. And for there, pollution is an example. And it's an example not because pollution is an externality, but because it is an externality that affects distant peoples. Or let me make it more precise. Imagine that my rights enforcement agency and your rights enforcement agency is arguing on whether you have a right to sue me if I pollute your air. If the customers of the two agencies are the only people involved, the net gain from your having a right to sue me in that situation is positive. So both firms will agree to allow that rule. But if much of the air pollution is affecting people who are customers of a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh rights enforcement agency, they aren't in on the bargaining, therefore those costs will be ignored. So the result is that you will have a less than optimal level of legal protection against pollution, especially distant pollution. And along similar lines, you will have a less than optimal level of protection for intellectual property. Because if your agency agrees that you are bound by my copyrights, that imposes a variety of costs and benefits on both of us. But one benefit is I write more books. And that's a benefit for people who are customers of other rights enforcement agencies. That benefit gets ignored by your and my agency in their bargaining. So even if enforcing copyright law actually is a net desirable thing, it may not happen. So those are my two standard examples of what I think of as market failure on the market for law. But then the response is there's no reason to expect the system we now use to give us anything like optimal law. It's not at all clear. My guess, well, I don't want to overstate it. It is certainly arguable that IP law at present does more harm than good. And I think it's pretty clear, well, I'm pretty sure that copyright law only makes sense in its old version where it was protecting against literal copying, against someone taking my book and just copying the full text and putting it out. And in that form, it's hard to enforce nowadays because everything is digital. But copyright law has been expanded to be something a lot more like patent law in terms of ideas like look and feel. And I don't think it works very well for those. I think it probably imposes net costs. There's actually a book called Against Intellectual Monopoly by a couple of economists who argue that all IP law is a bad thing. And I'm not sure they're right, but they make a case for that claim. And true to their principles, you can read the book for free online. Google for Against Intellectual Monopoly if you want to find a reasonably coherent argument for that position, for that argument for that side of the debate.
Yeah, so you brought up a couple of things. So one of the things you brought up was defense spending is largely a question of stability rather than a problem of a market failure. It seems to me that it's
due to market failure. But that market failure is a problem because it can result in in another state imposing its rules on you.
Well, it seems that even if the state remains stable, you can still have harmful externalities involving defense spending. So, for example, if the United States, being part of NATO, is a worldwide public good that provides benefits to a lot of countries and curtails a variety of conflicts, even though us having a much smaller military that only protects the US would not endanger the stability of the US as a nation, it would just make the world generally a worse place.
And this depends a lot on your interpretation of foreign policy issues. And since my view is that on the whole, the US would be much better with a non-interventionist foreign policy, that we have been protecting Europe from an enemy who has got, what, a fifth the GNP of Europe? I don't know, you'd have to add up the numbers, but if you added up the EU countries' GNP, it's a whole lot larger than Russia's GNP. And I think in general that if you imagine that the government is run by a very wise dictator, as it were, a Metternich figure is the way I like to put it, or maybe a Talleyrand, then an interventionist policy might make sense. But if you look at what the U.S. has actually done, we spent quite a long time. We got into one war basically because we were defending China from Japan. We then got into noticeable chunks of the Cold War defending Japan from China. And we eventually discovered that China was our natural ally against Russia. And then after we did that, Russia collapsed, China went more or less capitalist. It's not clear we're not actually fighting them at this point. And I think the same thing is true in many other cases, that if you actually look around the world, that the interventionist foreign policy has generally done more harm than good, so losing it is not a cost. The standard story for the interventionist foreign policy is the lesson of Munich. And people misread the lesson of Munich, because the reason Munich happened was because England and France did not have a non-interventionist policy. If they had, Hitler wouldn't have had to ask their permission, but he asked their permission and got it. And that's an example of the way in which interventionist policies in the real world don't actually do what their bill is doing, because the people who are running them are not sort of wise and benevolent, super diplomats. My other sort of story that goes with that, which is something I discovered when I read the first volume of Churchill's History of the World War II, which is an interesting book. The first time that Hitler wanted to annex Austria, do you know who stopped him?
I do not.
Mussolini.
It's interesting.
Hitler made moves to annex Austria, and Mussolini moved Italian divisions into the Brenner Pass that connects Italy to Austria, and announced that Italy would not put up with such an annexation. All right. What happens? Germany backs down. Next thing that happens is that Italy gets into a very unpleasant war in Abyssinia. And Italy, you have to remember, was on the Allied side in World War I. In fact, Mussolini was. Mussolini broke with the Italian socialist movement because he supported Italian involvement in World War I on the Allied side, as opposed to non-involvement. I don't think anybody wanted them to involve in the other side. Italy gets into this very unpleasant war in Abyssinia, essentially a sort of a colonial war, really is a colonial war. And the other allies, France and England in particular, tell Italy this is a very bad thing to do. This is just horrible. You just have to stop doing it. We'll embargo aluminum, which Italy, if I remember correctly, was a exporter of, not an importer of, so that they make a big fuss about it and do nothing very effective. And Mussolini reaches two conclusions. One of them is that these people are not his friends, and the other is they're not very dangerous enemies. And the next time Hitler wants to seize Austria, Mussolini says, go ahead. And Hitler says, if there's ever anything I can do for you, just let me know, and annexes Austria. And that I thought was interesting, because if Churchill thought that there were two alternatives for France and England with the Abyssinia, that either they could hold their nose and ignore it on the grounds they wanted to keep Italy as an ally, which up to that it had been, or they could intervene with force. After all, the French and the British Navy were much larger than the Italian Navy, and there is no practical land connection between Italy and Abyssinia, right? Not unless they go all the way through Egypt, which was not exactly available to them since it was controlled by England at the time. So that meant that they could have stopped it. They'd have to use the threat of military force to do it. That, in Churchill's view, would have brought down Mussolini's government. He would have been replaced by somebody else. We don't know what happens after that. But what they actually did gave Hitler his only important ally. Initially, Japan came in much later. And I guess Russia came in at one point for a little while too. But his only serious ally, as it were, was Italy. And that was given to him in Churchill's own view because England and France had an interventionist foreign policy, and they ran it wrong. So that's sort of my general view. It's part of my general view that you shouldn't evaluate whether the government should do something by assuming they'll do it right. You should try to use theory and evidence to figure out how they'll actually do it.
Yeah. So in terms of evaluating how the government actually does it, so there was a recent study that I looked at that concluded that over the past, since I believe 1980, EPA regulations had saved several million lives. It seems like even though government is not, I would prefer that the EPA employed more Pigouvian taxes, but it seems like given the sheer magnitude of just that, 2 million is a big number. That seems to be a strong, pretty strong
that number was being offered by people who presumably had some axe to grind. It might be true, it might not be, but I would point out that the FDA itself admitted that one decision killed 100,000 people. That's not how they put it, of course. When the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, decided to permit the use of a beta blocker to prevent second heart attacks, beta blockers had been in common use for, I think, over 10 years in Europe at that time. And when the FDA finally decided to do it, they put out a self-congratulatory statement saying they decided to do this and they expected it to save 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year. All right, if it saves 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year, and they prevented its use, or at least made its use very difficult. You could, presumably a doctor who was willing to subscribe off-label uses could still do it, but doctors mostly don't do that for various prudential reasons. For something like 10 or 12 years, that meant that they caused about 100,000 unnecessary deaths. Same standard as your EPA. They didn't go and kill anybody. The EPA didn't go in and rescue anybody, but they made decisions that result in people dying. And that's a single FDA decision, all right? If you try to add up the numbers, as you may know, Peltzman did a calculation, a statistical study, quite a long time ago, on the effect of one change in FDA regulation. And this was a change which required that in order to be legal to sell a drug, you had to show not only that it was safe, but that it was useful, that it actually provided some benefit over what was already out there. So Peltzman tried to do two things. He tried to say, what was the effect of this change on the rate at which companies were introducing new medical drugs? And what was the effect on the average quality of new medical drugs? The answer to the first was that it reduced the number of drugs being introduced per year roughly in half. That's a huge change. As far as he could tell, there was no effect on average quality. He had a number of different proxies by which he tried to figure out how you would spot improvements in quality. You can probably find the article if you want. It's Samuel Peltzman. I could find the site if you really wanted. So it looks as though that single decision, and this is just one decision, this is a change in FDA regulations due to legislation, due to, I think, Kefauver, if I remember correctly, was responsible for it. Think about the effect of, in effect, wiping out half the medical drugs in the world, or at least in the US. That kills an awful lot of people. So it may well be that the EPA is on net done benefit. You'd like to know more about it. In particular, you would like to do a calculation which is looking also at people who died as a result of EPA activity. If you're really looking at it, all of these things, the trouble with externality arguments, in my experience, is that you first decide whether it's a bad or a good thing. And if you've decided it's a bad thing, you add up all the negative externalities. And if you decide it's a good thing, you add up all of the positive externalities. So if we think about externalities from EPA decisions, if one of their decision makes electric power more expensive, which I would guess that it did, not having studied the subject at all, but if you impose restrictions on the use of fossil fuels, you would do that. More expensive power means that some people are colder in the winter. Cold kills people. In a sense, what I'm saying is you would have to do a much more careful analysis than maybe they did it. But I guess the first question I would ask is, was there any item in that study for ways in which the EPA decisions resulted in more deaths?
Yes, so it said that in terms of the economic impact of the costs, of just the economic costs versus the economic benefits of EPA regulations on average, the benefits, just purely economically, not even in terms of lives, outweighed the costs by about 30 to 1.
And what did they list any costs in lives?
Let's see. I don't remember the exact source.
I just think you're too willing to trust a study, and that I start trusting a study only when several people with opposite axes to grind have looked at the issue, and when somebody has done it, and then somebody else has taken it apart and shown it's wrong, and then someone on the first side shows why the second critique is wrong. Enough of that. Let me tell you something that happened to me when I was, I think, younger than you are now. I was looking at colleges. I was probably 15 at the time, maybe 16, and I went to Yale. And Yale was having a program on the House Un-Americans Activity Committee for some reason. And it started, at least the first thing I saw, I think the way it started, was a film called Operation Abolition, which was done by supporters of the Un-American Activities Committee. And it clearly showed that the campaign to shut down the committee was the work of the Communist Party, of specific named communists, and they had films and all the rest of it. Then I saw a second movie. And at some point, I actually managed to find a reference to it online. And so I found out what the what the title of it is, but I've forgotten. But it was written by the other side. And that movie demonstrated very convincingly that the first movie was a fraud, that it distorted in many different ways what had really happened. And then I think there were only 2 movies, but there were people on the HUAC side, as I remember, who had written text. And the written text was critiquing the second film. And I think there were people on the other side critiquing that, but I don't swear to that. And that, I like to say that that's what I learned at Yale. I didn't go to Yale as a student. I went to Harvard instead. But that was a noticeable part of my education because it made me much more skeptical of somebody who says, here is the study that proves that my conclusion is right. And I've to some extent observed the process happening, because another story I can tell you, which happened, maybe 8 or 10 years later. I spent a summer in Washington as a congressional intern, and my congressman lent me 4 days a week to the Joint Economic Committee. And the Joint Economic Committee lent me to a project on state and local finances of George Washington University, which was simultaneously the project on state and local finances of the Joint Economic Committee and of the Governor's Conference. So they had at least 3 hats, maybe more than 3 hats. And I worked with them for, I don't know, a month or something. And what they were doing was producing a fact book, an account of the facts about state and local finance that a concerned citizen ought to know. And I discovered a fact. The fact that I discovered was unquestionably true because it was a demographic fact about people already born. It was unquestionably important because it was a fact about the largest single expenditure of state and local governments, which is schooling. They refused to include it in their fact book. They didn't deny it was true. Why did they refuse to include it? Because the fact implied that the needs for money of states and localities would be lesser than you would otherwise expect, and they wanted to persuade people it would be more. All right, I sometimes think of that as my loss of innocence, because these were academics, they were nice people, and they were being deliberately dishonest. They were pretending to give information when they were actually giving propaganda, where they were selecting the fact. The fact, by the way, was what was happening to the ratio of school-age people to employed people. That what had happened, as you may know, after World War II, there was a big increase in birth rates, what's called the baby boom. I guess I was a part of it, although the very beginning of it, because I was born in 45. And the result was that as the baby boom went into the K through 12 system, the ratio of school-age kids to taxpayers was going up, which meant that in order to maintain the level of per pupil expenditure, you had to raise the taxes that were paying for it. By the time that I was in Washington, the baby boom was coming out of that age group and into the employment age group, which meant that for the next, 10 years or so, the ratio of school-age kids to taxpayers was going down, which meant you could maintain the same level of expenditure with lower taxes. And they were not willing to include that fact in their fact book. So, as I say, your particular fact could, for all I know, be true. It's just that I've run it. There have been enough cases where I've had reason to look at things fairly carefully, then I'm much more skeptical than you are about any single claim that I have not seen, as it were, argued over by serious people on both sides.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that you're bringing up is that sort of there is a distinction between what an ideal government would do, what I believe you referred in your book as if a government was run by a combination of a supercomputer and Mother Teresa, what they would do. And so they're perfectly wise and all-knowing and craft the best policies, and what the government actually does. But it seems to me that if we're arguing about just completely getting rid of government, which is presumably not especially politically feasible,
mm-hmm.
I don't see any reason why we should not be able to conceive of a government that runs reasonably well if we're comparing what goal we should work towards. Because if neither of them are especially politically feasible, I don't see the reason for excluding one in our analysis.
But if I'm willing to accept that principle, I don't see why I should be limited to doing that. Why can't I argue for an anarchy that works right? All right.
Well,
in the case of anarchy, My obligation is to say, given the system I'm describing, what will happen? In the case of government, we can use both theory and evidence. We have a theory, which is called public choice theory, which tries to use the same approach I've been using for anarchy, which is basically market economics, and tries to say, what can we predict about the behavior of governments? And the prediction, there are a number of predictions. For example, you can predict that governments will benefit concentrated interest groups at the expense of dispersed interest groups, even when the benefit is much smaller than the cost. That fits the evidence. I could give lots of examples, but my standard example is tariffs. Economists David Ricardo worked out the economics of foreign trade just about 200 years ago. I guess a few more years than that by now. Since then, the general consensus of economists has been that, as a rule, a tariff hurts the country that imposes it. There are some special exceptions, but that's the usual pattern. Since then, almost no country has had free trade. The two striking counters to that were England in the 19th century and Hong Kong, which isn't a country but was a separate polity in effect in the 20th century. Both of those were very successful. Hong Kong spectacularly successful. Nonetheless, the rest of the world, including the US at present, has tariffs. Well, a tariff benefits a concentrated interest group, the industry that's being protected. The cost is spread across all of the customers of that industry, plus all producers of export goods, because if we import less, we export less. That's a very dispersed group. So it seems to me that we have a case where we've got a good theory. We have quite a lot of evidence supporting that theory, and it isn't consistent with what you want to do. That one of the things that's wrong with a lot of political arguments is people think they can argue about what should happen instead of what will happen. That you act as if government can just be programmed to do whatever you like, and it doesn't seem to be the case any more than anarchy can.
Sure. So if you were designing just your optimal system of government, would that government, if you could assume that just it does not expand beyond its basic limits,
how do you prevent them from doing that? We set this arrangement up somewhat over 200 years ago. And we ended up with a government in a Supreme Court which held that a farmer growing crops to feed to his own animals was engaged in interstate commerce. Because one of the limits in the Constitution was that the government could only regulate the things the Constitution said it could regulate, and one of the things the Constitution said it could regulate was commerce between the states.
Well, so it seems like if the rule that was set up was just you can have a basic military, a police force, Pigouvian taxes based on rigorous analysis that looks at the environmental harm.
How do you enforce that? How do you enforce that rigorous analysis criterion? What do you do when somebody says we need a Pigouvian tax on X, and the real reason is that the competitors of X want that tax, but they can certainly fudge up arguments to show that X produces negative externalities? Happens all the time.
I would agree that it's always possible to find one or two studies that find a conclusion. So perhaps you would have to look at the consensus of scientific literature, but I think we already have estimates of environmental impacts for things, and I think they obviously don't work perfectly, but I think they generally work reasonably well for determining things like that. But it seems like your argument is that a world without a government would generally be better than a world with a government, but the optimal world with a government, like
the optimal world has to mean the real world with the best designed government. It doesn't mean the real world with the government that does the best things the government can do, because we don't have a way of making a government that acts that way.
Yeah. So one interesting area of externalities that I haven't heard people bring up generally when talking about externalities is the issue of how animals are treated on factory farms. It seems to me that assuming that one holds the position that animals have moral value, which I think they do, it seems like the company will not take into account the animal's welfare. And
That's
as it
not,
was.
that isn't quite right. If many of the customers care about the animal welfare enough so that they will prefer to buy products produced in a farm that uses cage-free chickens or whatever the particular issue is, then that gives some firms an incentive to raise chickens that way. So if 10% of the population feels strongly about it, you would expect that the result would be about 10% of the chickens would be brought up that way. If 90%, 90%. And if only 10% feel that way, it's not at all clear what reason you have to expect the government to impose restrictions of that sort, which are politically unpopular, which injure a concentrated interest group, namely the industry that's doing the factory farming. So how do you set up a system that it certainly is true that if you want a particular thing done, if you value animal happiness, you will be unhappy if not enough other people do, so that the market produces the outcome you want. But there's no reason to expect the political system to produce the outcome you want.
Sure. So I think that I think that
notice that at present it is legal to do the things you're objecting to, but there are in fact firms that advertise the fact that they're producing, cage-free eggs, and I don't remember which of the other ones, free range, this and that.
Sure. So there are a variety of restrictions placed by the government. There's also a lot of market forces that incentivize doing things like reducing the inhumane practices in factory farms. But it seems like if we're talking about what we would like the government to look like, what you would like the government to do, or how you would like the government to be set up. What I want you to do is to specify how the government structure is set up, and then see whether that government will in fact do the things you want. You don't get to specify outcomes because you don't know that your institutions can produce those outcomes anymore. Look, the capitalism is perfect. All I've got to do is to say the capitalism I'm defending is a capitalism where all capitalists care about all effects on everybody in the world, and they know lots about it, and therefore they all act that way and so forth. It's just not believable, right? I don't get to specify a capitalism where no market failure happens, and you don't get to specify a political system where no market failure happens. Well, it seems like if we look at the current political system, even though I think that there's far from adequate protections for animals right now, it seems like there are at least some protections that would not exist absent the government. And I think just the sheer level of importance of those protections, just given how many sentient beings we're talking about, makes it monumentally important. So, for example, given that there are something like 10 billion factory farmed animals in the United States alone.
Most of them chickens.
Yeah. If a policy reduces the suffering of chickens, even a relatively insignificant amount per chicken, the sheer effect over the billions and billions of chickens seems to be quite a substantial effect.
On the whole, I weight human welfare quite a lot heavier than chicken welfare. So you want to also weight the effect of these things on 300 million humans, and you'd have to know a whole lot more than I do about the effects. So again, it seems to me you can always find something government is doing which you think makes things better, and I can always find something government is doing that I think makes things worse. But I don't see a strong reason. I don't think that's much of a reason to have a government. That governments also fight wars, which do a whole lot of damage, and they do various things that do environmental damage. That if you compared, say, the Soviet Union to the U.S. in terms of pollution, my understanding is the Soviet Union was a disaster. And it was a disaster because the land didn't belong to private people who had a strong incentive to maintain its quality and productivity. And therefore, different people making decisions could ignore costs they were imposing on others. It was a political system rather than a market system. So anyway, I mean, one of the things my father told me a long time ago is that you shouldn't expect to convince somebody with an argument for two reasons. One of them is anybody you can convince in one argument will probably be convinced the other way by somebody else tomorrow. And the other is that the real function of the argument is to give people ideas with which they might later convince themselves. So that is what I'm trying to do for you and for your audience. And I don't really expect that you will end up at the end of this concluding that, yes, government is terrible and anarchy is the right way to go. But I am trying to give you some reasons to consider that that might be the case.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just listing out areas where I don't think the market produces optimal outcomes. But one other area where I don't think the market produces optimal outcomes is in the area of redistribution of wealth. I don't think that it's a market failure in the traditional sense.
Correct.
But I think that if one is a utilitarian, which
if one is you are a utilitarian?
Yeah.
Right. So let me take my standard anti-utilitarian example. There have been several murders in a small town. You're the sheriff. The people have gotten really angry, and they're almost certainly going to lynch 2 or 3 suspects. You can't stop them doing that, unfortunately. However, you can frame one suspect who you're pretty sure is innocent, but you can frame him, convict him, and execute him. It looks, and you believe you can get away with this. So one life is, killing one person is a smaller loss of utility than killing 3 people. Should you do it?
I think that you should.
You think you should? All right.
And I think that does sort of that, like, saying that one would frame an innocent man invokes a slightly uncomfortable feeling in one's stomach. But I don't see a reason to trust that just sort of our base moral intuitions as being a
Do you have a reason to trust your intuition that increasing utility is good? That's a moral intuition too. You can't prove it.
Well, so I think I do have a reason to trust the intuition that increasing utility is good. But I also think that there's a distinction between the sort of base level intuitions about what is basically valuable. I think that we're better able to adjudicate the question of whether or not suffering is a bad thing than we are to adjudicate complex applications of the moral rule. So I don't see a reason.
Suffering is a bad thing is too simple a statement, because utilitarianism goes way beyond suffering is a bad thing. That would give you a sort of Pareto utilitarianism, which would say that if there is some way of reducing one person's suffering that has no cost on anybody else, you should do it, which most people would agree to. The utilitarian has to go beyond that. It has to say, if we can reduce your suffering by 10 units at the cost of increasing mine by 8, we should do that. And I'm not going to argue that the comparison is meaningless, because I think that, in fact, utility is a useful concept. But I don't think it's at all obvious that that conclusion is true, that most of us also have moral intuitions which say that if the way that increases your utility by 10 units involves not punishing you for a crime you deliberately committed, involves something that to my intuition is clearly unjust, at a cost to me who's an innocent victim of it, that probably we shouldn't do it. That I think our moral intuitions include the fact that suffering is bad and happiness is good, but also various intuitions about justice and things of that sort being good. It's not as simple. Let me just for a moment, this is really a digression, but it's a digression you probably haven't thought about, and it's an interesting one. Should you be maximizing total utility or average utility?
I think you should maximize total utility.
Totally.
I'm willing to bite the bullet on the...
Good. I'm glad you've thought about it.
On the repugnant conclusion, which I think is inaptly named, given that I don't think it's particularly repugnant. But
so if we are choosing between an America of 300 million people, all of whom are happy, and an America of 900 million people who are pretty miserable, but not miserable enough to commit suicide, so they've got positive utility. And I suggest that if we want to take quantitative utility seriously, we should use von Neumann's definition of utility that makes it a matter of amount. So it's very simple. The question is, would your would your people imagine that your three poor people were given the option of rolling a die. 1 through 4, they get executed painlessly. 5 to 6, they become one of the rich people in the smaller population. How badly off do they have to be before they're willing to take that deal? That's the closest I can come to comparing the total utility of 3 people to 1 person, because I'm willing to say that being dead is 0 utility. And if you put it that way, then the question is, would you really prefer the larger society that's that much, where people are that much worse off to the smaller? I should say, I don't think there's a good answer to the question. I have an old published article in which I try to set up a sort of a Pareto-like criterion, in which I say sometimes we have a way of saying that the larger society is better and sometimes the smaller society, but some societies are not going to be comparable under this.
Yeah, so I think that with thought experiments like that, the reason why I don't generally trust moral intuitions when it comes to specific thought experiments, things like the trolley problem, the repugnant conclusion,
Yes.
etc., is I think that our intuitions about that generally result in massive contradictions, and they're generally not especially reliable. So, for example, there was a paper in 2013 by a man named Nick Beckstead, which looked at the track record of our moral intuitions and concluded that our moral intuitions throughout history and in the present are very often result in horribly wrong conclusions. So one interesting case was if you have people who are thinking about how much money they want to donate to some foreign country, if they know that they're donating to a foreign country where they will help out 100 people, in a refugee camp of 1 million people, they're less likely to donate than if it's in a refugee camp of 1,000 people, even though they're helping out the same number of people, because it's a larger percentage, which that morally obviously makes no sense.
But this, of course, is also true about our views of physical reality, that people distort their views of physical reality in a bunch of ways. We know, for example, that a lot of people think of driving as more dangerous than flying, although per mile flying is much the safer of the two, that in various ways our intellectual tools for figuring the world out are imperfect. We've got limited capacity. And therefore, certainly some of our moral intuition is going to come out wrong, just as some of our physical intuition comes out wrong. In fact, for our perception of the physical world, we've got some pretty striking cases, because it is absolutely clear to our intuition about how the physical world goes, if you think about it for a few minutes, that if I'm in a train going at 50 miles an hour that way, and I'm walking at 10 miles an hour, I am passing something outside of 60 miles an hour. Velocities add, but it doesn't turn out to be true. We can also show very clearly that if the velocities are high enough, they don't add. That, c plus 0.5 is c. So that's an extreme case where it turns out that using our minds to understand the world did a very good job, but not a perfect job. And that's probably true for moral reality as well. But of course, your argument would apply to utilitarianism as well. That's only a moral intuition.
Well, so I think that one argument as to why utilitarianism is generally more reliable than some other moral theories is that if you look at the track record of utilitarian philosophers throughout history, they have a much better moral track record.
We've only had utilitarian philosophers since sometime in the 19th century, right? Bentham invents utilitarianism.
Right. So if you look at their predictions and then you compare them to the predictions of many other philosophers, they were often very far ahead of their time. So, for example, Bentham, I believe, thought that gay marriage was perfectly permissible, which was quite a progressive view in the 19th century.
We don't know if it's right or not. We don't know what the actual consequences in the real world are going to be. We've changed. Our society has changed radically in a number of ways, certainly in my lifetime. Of course, most of the moderns think those are improvements because that's what we have now. but I don't think you can reliably assume we're right. Let me tell you a different story. I've got lots of stories. And this one is about marriage. Very long time ago, I was sitting in the airport in Bombay waiting for a flight to Sydney, Australia. And I got into a conversation with an Indian woman who was waiting for the same flight. And we ended up sitting next to each other and talking through the whole flight. She was from southern India. She was an intelligent, obviously educated woman. She was flying to Sydney to join her husband, who was a physician in Sydney. They had been married by the choice of their parents. In southern India, the usual pattern is not courtship by the individuals, but that the parents find you a spouse. The two of you can veto it if you don't think you can get along, but you normally don't. All right. This was not a figure out of history. This was a contemporary. She was, as an intelligent, educated person. I couldn't show that she was wrong. In fact, the small bit of data we had at that point was that this was shortly after the breakup of my first marriage, which of course had been done by the standard American method of our finding each other and deciding to get married. She was still happily married to her husband. So to the extent we had any data on the subject, it was that her system worked better. So I'm reluctant to say, because these are the things we now think are the right way of doing it, that's a good reason to see it as moral progress. That at almost any time in history, if you ask people, they believed in moral progress, because at almost any time they believe that their current views are the right ones. Their current views are in some way different from the views of their ancestors. Therefore, you've obviously learned more about morality.
Sure. So I think that if one, like,
gay marriage isn't a good example. The clearest example to me is the change in the attitude to sexual behavior. That we've gone from a society where the normal assumption was that legitimate sex was in marriage, that of course some other sex would occur, but nonetheless that was the ideal. And on the whole, people, and especially women who were willing to sleep with people they weren't married, you should probably look down on. That was a social attitude for quite a long time. It is not at all clear if that change was a good or a bad one. You know, one interpretation of what's happened is that change then resulted in a world in which men found it fairly easy to get sex without marriage. The result was that women who had wanted to have children had to produce children by themselves without a husband. And the result was that a whole lot of kids got raised in one-person families, which made them worse off. Now, there are other possible interpretations. I'm not saying I know what the answer is, but my point is that the sort of modern, arrogant assumption, because we do it this way now, and obviously that shows improvement, really is not a safe one.
Sure. There are some areas where I think that the early utilitarian thinkers made some predictions that I think
predictions or reached moral conclusions.
Reach moral conclusions. So, for example,
that you now agree with, and that shows they were right.
Well, I mean, to deny that they had good track record, one would have to deny, for example, to give the case of slavery. Slavery, I think we all in the modern world agree slavery is a bad thing. The utilitarians were very early and in broad consensus that slavery was a bad thing. I think that if one agrees with the moral conclusions of that, for example, gay marriage is permissible, that slavery is bad, then that serves as evidence that utilitarianism is generally a better moral theory.
It serves as evidence to you, but the experience that you can't have, or it's hard to have, is the equivalent of my conversation with the woman from India. What you really need is to find an intelligent person from 1700 who is not a utilitarian, who has a different view of philosophy, and see if you can really, talking to him, make it clear that he's wrong and you're right. Because, it's sort of easy to win arguments when the other side isn't there.
Well, right. I didn't see why that would be the relevant question. It seems to me that if they thought things about morality, and now the very broad consensus seems to be that those things were correct, regardless of whether or not you would be able to apply that reasoning to convince people who were raised in a culture where presumably it would be quite difficult to convince them that view is correct. I didn't see why
you were raised in a culture where it would be difficult to convince you that your view is wrong. Why does the idea that you can't trust people because they agree with their culture only apply to the other side?
Well, it seems that it's possible that our current moral views are very wrong, and the 17th century ones were correct, but it seems quite implausible. It seems exceptionally likely that slavery is quite a bad thing. I think that we have reached scientific.
Might it depend on the circumstances? Let's take an actual historical situation, and I'm thinking now of ancient Greece. City-states fight wars with each other. One of the city-states wins. What happens if it's agreed by everybody that slavery is a terrible thing you should never do? What do you do with the people you've defeated who are going to want to defeat you 10 years later if you just leave them alone? I think we know the answer to that question, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, so that's just sort of appealing to what people would do if they...
My point is that in that society, it's not at all clear that the belief in favor of slavery was wrong. Because in that society, slavery is still an ugly thing, but it may well be that in that society, not having slavery would be an even uglier thing, because it would lead to mass murder.
Right. So
our intuitions about slavery are partly formed by a world where that wasn't what was happening, by a world in which where you got slavery was to go to places you wouldn't be and pay the locals to capture other locals and give them to you so you could ship them off as slaves. And that, it seems to me, is not a very attractive arrangement. But I think you're going much too far when you say, Aristotle was obviously wrong in approving of slavery, which I'm pretty sure he did. I'd have to check to be sure. But in any case, now also, I don't know whether you're right about the utilitarians. The problem is, again, you tend to filter it through paying more attention to things you agree with than you didn't agree with. That Bentham, after all, was also in favor of setting up a prison where everybody was being watched all of the time. That was his panopticon. Most of us don't really think that was a great idea. And I think, Bentham wrote a huge amount, not all of which has ever been published as far as I know. And I suspect if you went through that, you would certainly find things where you think he was indeed ahead of his time, but not necessarily all of the things there.
Yeah, I would agree that it's obviously not definitively conclusive. It only serves as evidence. I think that if we look at the scientific consensus of how their moral predictions or their moral claims matched up to our moral claims, and the moral claims that seem to be clearly correct in the modern world where we have more knowledge and information.
I'm sorry, what is the difference between our moral claims and the moral claims that seem to be clearly correct to us in the modern world? Aren't those the same statement?
Yeah, I suppose they are. I suppose that sentence was a bit redundant.
If we don't really have a good way of discovering moral truth, I don't think you have a legitimate presumption that the current fashions in moral truth are necessarily better than the past ones. Might be, might not be. You'd like to,
Yeah. So one theoretical argument for utilitarianism is that this argument is similar to the veil of ignorance.
I know, but you want Harsanyi's version instead of Rawls because Harsanyi did it right and Rawls did it wrong. Is that what you're about to say? I'll save you the time.
Close. That's one of the arguments that I was planning to bring up later, but it's not this argument. But instead of the veil of ignorance where you're a random person, instead you are all people. You experience the sum total of all conscious experiences.
It seems to me that Harsanyi's version makes more sense. Neither of them, I don't find either Harsanyi or Rawls compelling. Harsanyi at least logically follows through the logic of his assumption, given von Neumann utility, which Harsanyi, being an economist, understood. But you will notice that Harsanyi's version implies you should maximize average utility, not total utility. So where you do have a reasonably clear, straightforward argument, starting with a possibly disputable premise, it doesn't lead to the conclusion you want. You've got to create the even weirder assumption that you're imagining everybody at once in order to get what you want.
Right, that is the conclusion. So if we assume that that valuable experience, things that could have value in the universe, could only be captured through conscious experience. Absent a consciousness, there could not be value in the universe. Then if we took the sum total of all conscious experience and we did what we would do if we took into account everything that would benefit any of them, it seems like that would arrive at maximizing that which could conceivably have value in the universe, and it seems like we would also arrive at utilitarianism.
I don't see, how do you find out that the only thing that's of value is utility?
Well,
are you familiar with Nozick's experience machine?
Yeah. Again, I would bite the bullet on like I would plug into Nozick's experience.
You would plug into Nozick's experience machine. All right, I wouldn't. For anybody out there who isn't already familiar with it, what Nozick imagined was that you have what we would now think of as a virtual reality machine. And the guy who's got the machine, who for some odd reason you trust, has figured out what life you're going to live. And he says, look, plug into my machine and you will have an imaginary life, a convincing imaginary life. Once you're plugged in, you won't know you're plugged in, which is just a little bit better than the life you would have lived. So you'll end up making a couple of $1,000s more a year. Your children will be just a little bit better behaved, your wife a little bit prettier, but not a big difference. And the question is, do you plug in? And if all that matters to you is yourself, if all that matters is sensation, as it were, which now utilitarianism, it's true, is including sensation of other people as well as of yours. But if all that matters, in fact, you as a utilitarian shouldn't plug in, because you will no longer be doing things that raise the utility of other people once you're plugged in. But putting that point aside, if all that matter, if value is defined as feelings of happiness, or as something like feeling of happiness, or happiness net unhappiness, something like that, which is roughly the Benthamite assumption, then pretending to live a life is just as good as really living it. And I don't want that. I want to have actually written books that people read and that are interesting, and have actually created interesting and original ideas, and to have actually brought up children who I'm proud of. I don't just want to believe I have.
So one sort of modification, actually, before we go on to this, I
assume you've arranged your life so that you never get information that will make you unhappy. So, for example, if the Chinese are badly mistreating the Uyghur in China, you would like not to know about it, right? Because that'll make you unhappy. You can't do anything about it anyway.
I think that when there would be a cost to setting up my life such that it filtered out information that made me upset. And I think that even sad information can often be sometimes interesting to learn about, and it's relevant to not repeat the lessons of history. But if I could just filter out information that didn't teach me anything, that at no cost, that just made me sad, I would absolutely do it.
That taught you, not that didn't teach you anything, that didn't teach you anything that was useful to making you happy in the future. Or making other people happy in the future, because that's all you're caring about.
Right. Yeah, I would filter out that information. Before we continue the discussion, a friend of mine, a person named Michael Moreno, who has a pretty substantial YouTube channel, he says he would also be interested in at some point having a discussion with you. He's quite libertarian. He is more of a libertarian on ethical grounds. He has a view of meta-ethics.
Right. I have ethical beliefs, as everybody does, but my arguments for anarchy in particular and for libertarianism in general are economic arguments. And part of the reason I think I've been suggesting here that I have moral beliefs, I have a theory of where my moral beliefs come from and what they are, but I don't think I have good arguments for them. I don't think that I have a intellectually satisfactory way of showing somebody who disagrees with me about my moral views that I'm right and he's wrong. And I think I do have an intellectually satisfactory way, not a perfect way, but a satisfactory way of showing people that there are arguments for economic views that they ought to take seriously. So I prefer In sort of deciding how I live my life, I've got to use my moral views. But in deciding how to persuade people of what kind of society I want, I prefer to base that on my economic views. And that's a way in which I differ from a lot of other libertarians, including a lot of other anarchists, that there's a general theme, as it were, among some anarchists, partly coming out of Ayn Rand and partly coming out of Murray Rothbard, that says that you start out by realizing that initiating coercion is always wrong. Then you just draw the conclusions of that. So it's a straightforward moral argument. And yes, it's very convenient that the result is a prosperous and happy society, but that's just a side effect. And I don't agree with that position.
Yeah. In my youth, when I was around 10, I was far more libertarian. There was a span of a few days after I'd read your book when I was convinced of anarchy, and then I thought about it a little more, and I became no longer convinced.
Mm-hmm.
But
there was quite a long time when I was convinced that you needed a government, and it seemed to me that I had sort of in the back of my head a theorem, though I couldn't actually prove it, that showed that although the market was great, the framework for the market, the legal system, had to be produced exogenously. And then I read a convincing fictional description of a society, not mine, in which the framework was endogenous. And I concluded that, therefore, since a single counterexample destroys a theorem, it wasn't in general true that you had to have an exogenous framework provided by the government. And that's what started me thinking about trying to imagine what in the real world, in my society, such a system would look like. And that was about 50 years ago. And over about the last 15 or 20 years ago, I was teaching a seminar on legal systems very different from ours every other year at the law school. And I concluded that in my first book, I had reinvented the wheel, that in fact, societies in which law enforcement was private and decentralized were not all that uncommon historically. And that what I had been doing was creating a high division of labor, modern world version of something that historically had existed in quite a lot of places.
Yeah, when I remember I was listening to a talk you'd given, I think, and one thing that you mentioned, which I found persuasive, as one of the reasons why you weren't convinced by the moral case alone for utilitarianism, is you gave a hypothetical where the world is going to end as a result of asteroids or something, and the only way to stop it is
but it's not utilitarianism, it's the libertarian moral case I'm not convinced by.
Right. And the
natural rights claim that you should never violate rights, whatever the benefit of doing so, and that's right, where my asteroid story comes in. But my conclusion from all of this, I reject my sheriff framing somebody at the beginning of this conversation, and my view is that both human happiness and respecting rights matter. They are both values. Neither of them is infinitely valuable. That you don't have a lexicographic order in which you say we first do A, and then once we've maximized A, we're free to maximize B. What you have rather is a set of trade-offs, just as economics. It's the way I'm trained to think, as it were. I doubt that I'll ever get it exactly right. I think it's quite likely that if there is a moral reality, I'm a moral realist, but I could be wrong. But my view is there really are true and false moral statements. But if there are, it may well be that reality is very complicated, that our physical reality is very complicated. We don't fully understand it. It's much easier to get a handle on that than on moral reality because we've got multiple senses to do it with instead of just one. So my view then is I do the best I can with my best estimate of what's right and wrong, but I don't really expect to get a clean, tidy, here are the three laws which tell you what you should maximize, whether utilitarian or libertarian.
Yeah, when it comes to morality, you said you thought that both rights and well-being are both valuable. Mm-hmm. So what is a right? Like, where do rights come from, and how do we go about determining if something is right? Yeah. Because it seems to me that all of the things that we think of as rights, if we look at them, they all seem to be very good heuristics for maximizing well-being. And so as a result of that, I think that rights are only instrumentally valuable for maximizing well-being, but there's nothing valuable about them in and of themselves.
Yeah, and therefore you are willing as a sheriff to frame an innocent man and hang him. But since I don't agree with that conclusion, I'm not. That the question of where rights come from, there are obviously multiple possible answers. And I really have two quite different answers. One of them is my moral philosophy answer, and that is that rights are a very partial description of moral truth. That the statement, I have a right not to be murdered, says it is wrong of other people to murder me. And furthermore, it is not wrong of me to use force to stop somebody else from murdering me. That's a proposition about moral reality. It's based on my moral intuition. It might be wrong, but that's the philosophical answer that I would offer to your question of where moral rights come from. Now, there are at least two other possible answers. One of them is moral nihilism. One of them is to say rights are just an illusion. In fact, all moral propositions are illusion, yours as well as mine. We have been brainwashed by our genes because, after all, your argument about it being about useful proxies could also say that caring about other people's welfare is just a useful proxy. We evolved in small societies. Somebody who cares for other people's welfare is more valuable to them, and so they're willing to keep them alive and feed them when there's a famine. And you could tell the story in which either utilitarianism or rights or both are produced by evolutionary biology. That's a possible story. You could also claim that one or the both of them is produced by societal conditioning, that your society has brainwashed you into it. That's what I think of as the moral nihilist position, and it's a defensible position, unfortunately, but not mine. And then I've got a third answer to where rights can come from, and that's an article of mine at a chapter in the third edition of Machinery on what I call a positive account of rights. And that's one which explains rights as a pattern of human behavior. It's neither a legal nor a moral account. It's an economist's account, as it were. And on that account, rights represent Schelling points which determine our commitment strategies. That the statement, I have a right not to be killed, really means people will probably not find it in their interest to kill me, because I and other people have commitments which imply that we will bear quite large costs to do something to you if you kill me. Or in my case, to prevent being killed. Well, that one I'd bear costs for anyway. But that the pattern of rights, it seems to me, is... Do you know about territorial behavior in animals? You've seen lots of my YouTube, so you probably do.
I haven't followed your YouTube.
Right.
In several years.
We observe the following pattern of behavior in many species, mostly birds and fishes, but some mammals. The individual marks out in some way a territory that he's claiming. He then apparently turns a switch in his brain such that if another member of his species and gender trespasses, he will fight that. And he will fight more and more desperately the farther into his territory the other one comes. Now, unless there's a very large inequality in power, a fight to the death is going to be a loss for both sides. Even if the trespasser wins, he's likely to get injured, and most of the time, the benefits of trespassing aren't worth that. So the result is that you get a form of property rights, not transferable property rights, in lots of non-human species. My claim is that the pattern of rights as a form of behavior are simply a much more sophisticated version of that. That essentially it's not just property, that each of us has a mental picture of what are the things such that if somebody crosses this line, I should be willing to bear large costs to stop him, larger costs than what seems to be at stake. That in a functioning society, people's perception of this are consistent. You don't believe you have a right to something that I also have a right to, or at least very rarely, because if you do, we're going to get into a very expensive fight. And that's really the nature. Are you familiar with Schelling points?
I am not.
Focal points is the other term for that, invented by Thomas Schelling. The basic idea is that in some bargaining situations, what you're looking for is a unique outcome. So if you imagine that we're trying to divide something, and the longer we argue, the less is going to be there to divide. that if the situation is really symmetrical, we're likely to agree on a 50-50 split, even if neither of us thinks it's just, because agreeing on a 50-50 split is better than keeping on arguing. And he starts out not with an argument at all, but with two people who have to coordinate without communication, where two Yale students or Princeton students, I think it's Princeton students, are supposed to meet in New York at the same time, at the same place, with no previous advance. And what do? They're looking for a location in New York that is unique, that both of them will see as unique, and a time that's unique. And given our particular system of timekeeping, there are really only two times that look unique to us, right? Noon and midnight. Those look different in a sense in which 1 and 2 o'clock, morning or evening, don't look different. So they are likely to try to coordinate on either noon or midnight. When I originally heard this story, my reaction is they meet on the top of the Empire State Building, which was the tallest building in the world at the time. Turns out there is no such place, that the Empire State Building has 4 observation decks on 4 sides of it, so that they only have 1 chance in 4 of coordinating. Where they actually met when somebody did the experiment was under the clock at Grand Central Station. But the point is that the fact that there's a unique outcome gives a significant pressure towards bargaining towards, or without communication, agreeing to. The bargaining case is one where you can communicate, but neither of you believes the other one because you have. And my claim is that you can think of a functioning civil order as a very elaborate network of Schelling points, which represent the fact that if my neighbor tries to extort money from me by threatening to dump his trash across the fence, I'm willing to fight him, maybe in court, even if the cost of fighting him is much larger than the cost to me of having to deal with his trash. And I go on to explain that that's why the British fought the Falklands War, that the Falkland Islands clearly weren't worth the cost, weren't worth a significant fraction of the cost, but defending the Schelling point commitment strategy, if you seize British land, we'll fight you, was worth it. So that's a positive account of rights. And since you asked about rights, and that's probably my largest contribution to the idea of rights, I thought I would mention.
Yeah. Wait, I'm getting echo for some reason. Not
right.
sure.
I don't know how long you want to make this. I don't think I have anything to do till dinner time, which is 6. Where are you? Where are you geographically?
I am in California.
So am I. So we're on the same clock.
Yeah. So
there are people in the world who are not in California, as you may be aware. Sometimes it gets confusing. I was participating in an event this weekend where the first bit of it we pre-recorded because we had 3 people, one of them in California, one of them in Oxford, and one of them in India. And our time was very different.
Yeah, it's difficult to organize when people are in wildly different time zones. One thing you brought up when you brought up sort of whether you would go into the simulation if it would improve your well-being. A follow-up that someone asked, or an addendum to that thought experiment, was if you were told right now that you are currently in a simulation, would you choose to go out of your simulation if you knew that your life out of the simulation would be marginally worse? Sure. You would? As long as it's marginally worse, yes. So even if this simulation even if you knew that outside of this simulation you were entirely different, you're a reptile of some sort, we're all reptiles plugged into a computer, so your life would be completely different, but only marginally worse, would you unplug? Yeah, sure. The way I ask is I think that most people's intuition would say no, they would stick with this life, which to the extent that that's the conclusion that they reach, I think that indicates that it's largely a status quo bias rather than a bias towards things that are real versus. Why are you making in Nozick's case the 2 lives aren't strikingly different? So why do I have to be a reptile? Why don't we take the equivalent of Nozick's case, which is that I am in Nozick's experience machine already,
and somehow somebody gives me a red pill or whatever, and I've got a couple of hours in which to make up my mind about my future. And what I'm told is, well, this machine makes things just marginally better. That if you unplug your kid, your kid will take 50 minutes instead of 49 minutes to fall asleep, and it'll be a month later when you get the promotion, and you can make the whole list of things. Your income is a little lower, or price is a little higher, and then I think I unplug it because I want to see. In this case, part of the difference is that in that case you can really talk about the comparison, because I can then say, look, in my imaginary world, I've done the following things. I'd much rather have really done them, and that's what I get when I unplug.
Yeah, I think that my mortal intuition would say I would stick with whichever one was conducive to well-being. I think that most people's intuition would be to stick with the status quo, assuming there are not wild differences between the two worlds.
Can you define your well-being a little more clearly?
I think well-being can be defined as, I think it's synonymous with happiness. I think it's experiences that are in some sense worth experiencing.
So it sounds as though if drugs don't have much significant negative side effects, if you have some fairly safe pleasure drugs, or if you can plug a wire into your brain and stimulate the pleasure center of your brain, maybe for only an hour a day, so you've got time in order, you can eat and sleep and stuff, that you're all in favor of doing that, right?
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah, I think one thing, so you said that your view of metaethics was one that combines the protection of rights with the maximization of well-being.
Well, except maximization of even that's too simple, because there are things that I value that really don't fit in utility version. That I would, let me take a very simple case. Suppose I have written a book, as I have a number of books, and I would feel happier if I believed lots of people had read the books. And suppose that my second novel, which I'm pretty fond of, has only been read by a very small number of people, which unfortunately is probably true, but somebody can manage to tell me a lie about it. Maybe it's even a mistake. And I'm told it's sold 10,000 copies when it's really sold, let us say, 300 copies. That would make me happy. Would I like to be told that? I would not like to. I want to live in a world where my happiness is justified. It's hard to put that into utilitarian terms, but if I observe my own psychology, that's part of what matters to me. So that my choices are not as simple. See, utility has different meanings in philosophy and in economics. And in economics, utility describes what choices you will make. And in philosophy, it describes something like what you're saying: excess of pleasure over pain, happiness over unhappiness. The basically Bentham idea. Those are not the same things, because people don't always make the choices that maximize their happiness.
Yeah, so I think the distinction is that in economics, the thing that we talk about generally is utility. Is generally more of a preference utilitarianism, while in philosophy, it's more of a hedonistic utilitarianism.
Correct.
So would it be the case that there was an amount of well-being that could trump any of your any other value? So for example, if it would produce just an experience of bliss like you could not imagine.
I don't think so. I don't think that's hard to say for sure, because I haven't actually faced that temptation. You do observe that very few people masturbate as often as they could. That's the closest thing to the wireheading that we really have with the bodies we've been given. That's a way of getting a jolt of physical pleasure. And at least my impression is that although people do some of that, there's a reason why there's lots of porn out there. Nonetheless, people don't really act as if maximizing the flow of physical pleasure was a major part of their utility function.
Sure. So earlier you said that you thought that rights were valuable and well-being is also valuable. It's an amount of one of them can trump an amount of the other one. It's just a question of degree. So if you could get if you're in the sheriff situation, if your choice to set the mob on the innocent person would result in saving everyone in Algeria, if the mob didn't
may very well be you should do it then.
Right. So there's an amount of well-being that could track that. So there's an interesting
Though notice that's not well-being to me. That's a matter of well-being to other people.
Sure. So
after all, it wouldn't be satisfactory if you said, well, look, it's all right. You don't have to hang the innocent person. Everybody in Algeria will die, but we'll arrange so you don't know about it. Right. So that would, in terms of my happiness, be just as good as it's not happening. But it is not, in fact, what I'm interested in.
Right. But in terms of ethics from a public policy standpoint, you think that any rights claims, there's a certain amount of well-being that can eventually that can trump it.
Any rights claim. I don't know if that's right. I don't know. That is, rights claims have quantity too. And what I'm saying is that it is not a lexicographic ordering, like alphabetical order. It's not a case where a little bit more of this always trumps any amount of that. But it doesn't follow that there's always an amount of that that trumps any amount of this, however large. So I haven't thought about it enough, but maybe there are violations of rights that are bad enough so that no increase in happiness would trump them. And in addition, as I say, I think happiness in the philosopher's utilitarian sense is itself way too simple, because that's not all I care about. If I look at myself, that I don't want to just have my pleasure from the knowledge that somebody has read my books. I want to actually have somebody read my books. All right, and lots of other things out there. So I care about things in the real world other than their effect on my emotions.
Sure. I would suggest that anything that you care about, that you hold to be valuable in the real world, can ultimately be traced back to being a heuristic that's good for achieving well-being. So, for example,
why would that be the case? That is, you may believe in utilitarianism, but why would we have been sort of evolved into heuristics for utilitarianism? It seems to me that insofar as we have a decent theory, we should have been evolved into heuristics for reproductive success, right? The nice thing about evolutionary biology, its great advantage over economics, is that evolutionary biology knows what your utility function is. They knows what you're maximizing, what the individual utility function, because we are as if designed to maximize our reproductive success. And if you want to explain the patterns of things by something other than that we're perceiving truth, which you want to do, then it seems to me that's got to be what you do.
Right. I don't think that I don't think that we evolved to maximize utility in the way that I think we evolved to maximize our reproductive success. But I think that utility because I think well-being is that which is valuable. I think that utility is the only thing that is desired for its own sake. Other things we think of as valuable, but they're only desirable insofar as they achieve well-being. And
I'm not sure that I can always tell when you're making these statements whether you're talking about as a utilitarian or as an individual maximizing his utility. That is to say,
I'm generally talking about as a utilitarian.
Right. So from that standpoint, you would rather know about things than not know about them if the unhappiness to you from knowing about them is less than the average increase in happiness to the rest of the world as a result of your knowing about them. You believe that your knowing about the Chinese mistreating the Uyghurs in China makes you unhappy. From a selfish standpoint, you'd rather nobody ever told you about it. But if you know about it, you can put a tiny, tiny grain of sand on the scale to pressure China not to do it. And that has a tiny, tiny, tiny effect on Chinese behavior. And added up over all the damage that's being done, you figure that outweighs your unhappiness. But if it didn't, if it happened that you could have no effect on, or there's not a large enough effect, then you want to be kept in blissful ignorance, right?
Yeah.
So that is not your position. That is your position as a utility, right? That's your position as utilitarian, right? Right.
Yeah. One area that I think should be of importance to anyone who cares about utility, even if there are other things that they hold to be valuable, if they think that well-being is some section of that which holds value, then I think existential threat reduction serves as a great moral good. Because if we look at the potential amount of well-being and flourishing that it could exist in the far future, it's quite massive.
So you clearly ought to be an anarchist, because after all, the only human organizations that have even come close to having a threat to wipe out human society are all governments. Right? I think people exaggerated it a little bit, but it at least looked during the Cold War as though both sides had spent very large resources creating arsenals of thermonuclear weapons. And I think probably a realistic conclusion is that if we had all fired them, there would still have been some humans left when it was over. But a lot of people thought there wouldn't be. And so on that basis, you've got to abolish government, because no private organization is going to spend that much resource in collecting on killing people.
I think that I don't know if that follows. I agree that government provides a variety of existential threats. I think during the Cold War, existential threats were quite high and higher than many people realize. Mm-hmm. For example, are you familiar with the Petrov incident?
That was one where it could have started in a thermonuclear exchange. But as I say, I don't think that was really an existential threat. I may be wrong, but my impression is that just as with global warming, people tend to exaggerate things. It makes a better and more striking story if it's not just 70% of the world dying, but 100% of the world dying. And similarly, it makes a more moving story if global warming is going to wipe out civilization instead of make us a little poorer than we would be without global warming, which is closer to what the estimates really imply.
Yeah, I agree that it's unlikely that nuclear war would cause extinction, but I think that a world where every major city is wiped out, where civilization is effectively eliminated, there are small groups of people hunting and scavenging.
I don't think it would be even that bad. It's a big world. There would have been places, you can run civilization on a population of 100,000 people. It's just not as good a civilization as we have. It was done, after all, for quite long periods of time. So you would have various patchworks of places, and some of them you had hunter-gatherers, and some of them you would have, monarchies, and you'd have a whole bunch of things. There'd just be a lot fewer people around.
Right. I think that it's not a question of just whether or not civilization is wiped out, but it's a question of the potential future value of that civilization could hold. So I think if a world where there was a paper that found that there was a chance that because we're emitting so much debris in space, eventually there will be so much that we can't send an aircraft into space without it being immediately destroyed. And then
better not send any aircrafts into space. There's a lack of air there.
Not aircrafts, spaceships in space, right. And satellites, etc. There's a worry that will eventually be entirely unable to get outside Earth's atmosphere. I think that from a utilitarian perspective and from the perspective of maintaining the potential immense value of future civilization, I think that that's 99.99% of the way to an existential threat. I think that that would be morally worse, assuming there was no way to solve it in the
In terms of your general argument, my view is that trying to include in your calculations effects past a century is almost always a mistake. That the future is radically uncertain. We don't know enough to do it. If you try to imagine somebody even a century ago, let alone 2 centuries ago or 3 centuries ago, trying to figure out what would or would not be problems for us, they wouldn't have done a very good job of it. So when people talk, the version of this that I find most absurd is when people are worrying about storing nuclear waste and they say, well, will it be safe for 100,000 years? I have no reason to assume our species will exist in 100,000 years. If it does exist, it's going to be radically different than it now is. That after all, there is radioactive stuff that's in the earth already. That's how we got it in order to refine uranium and make atomic bombs and reactors and such. And somehow we've survived with that. But there are lots of other examples. But it just seems to me that that we have a hard enough time figuring out what's likely to happen in the next century without making decisions that impose costs today on the ground of the fact that we believe they will give us a benefit in 1,000 years or 10,000 years.
I think that's true of some things, like, for example, worrying about nuclear waste storage. But I think that if we take the assumption that human civilization will, on average, if we're around in 100,000 years, there will probably be general positive quality of life to people existing.
What do you define as we, by the way? Suppose it turns out that in 100,000 years there are no human beings at all, but the artificial intelligence that we created a century from now are running a thriving society of their own. But none of them are us. They're running on silicon, but they are people. Back when we had both them and us, you could have conversations with them. Mike in Heinlein's Moon is a Harsh Mistress is sort of a standard example of such a person. Does that count too?
If they're capable of experiencing well-being, then I think that would count.
Right.
So I think that if we assume that the value of the future is expected to be positive, given that in civilization, as Steve Pinker has pointed out, seems to be the quality of life of people has been going up relatively rapidly. Rates of disease have been falling. The world just generally seems to be getting better. I think that
the increase in happiness is probably a good deal slower than the increase in material improvements, though, insofar as you can judge by reading things written in the past. That is, if you the estimate that McCloskey offers is that the average real income of the developed world at this point is 20 to 30 times as high as the average was through most of history. And I don't have the impression, if I read, Casanova writing in the 18th century, or the Icelandic sagas written in the 13th and 14th century, or I haven't read much of classical antiquity, but I guess one can. It doesn't feel as though those people are 1/30th as happy as we are. So I think I probably agree that the increase in sort of lots of conditions is a net improvement for humanity, but I don't think you want to exaggerate how much it is. Now, continue your point.
Yeah, so I think that combined with the fact that there could be a enormous number of future people. So, for example, it's obviously hard to put down a definitive number here, but Nick Bostrom took sort of a upper bound that's relatively, that's a very pretty high-end estimate for the number of future people that there could be. And he concluded that it could be up to about 10 to the power of 52 future people.
Is this assuming that we populate the universe or just Earth?
Assuming that we populate the universe.
Yeah, there are some speed of light difficulties to doing that.
Yeah, well, if you took into account, assuming that we develop to other planets, and nothing wipes us all out, and we don't advance faster than the speed of light, but just generally civilization expands. Mm-hmm. He concluded it could be about 10 to the power of 54 years of life that could be experienced, which is equivalent to 10 to the power of 52 100-year lifespans.
Right.
It seems that even if the odds of realizing that are pretty low, even if we assume that the prior odds of that are 1 in 10 to the 15th, then we're still at a very big number, I think 10 to the 37th. And if we assume that any action would only have, let's say, a 1 in 10 to the 7th chance, or a 1 in 10 to the 15th chance of causing extinction, well, we're still at 10 to the 22nd. I think I probably messed up the math somewhere along the way. But so from that perspective, it would follow that if we're serious about promoting well-being, then existential threat reduction should be quite an important moral goal.
Mr. Pascal, this is a very convincing argument.
Yeah, I think I find Pascal's wager to be far more convincing than most atheists do. The reasons I'm not persuaded by Pascal's wager is it seems that that with Pascal's wager, first of all, one doesn't have the choice over what they believe. It also seems like for it to be the case that a all-loving God would cause unimaginable suffering to generally good people simply because they did not believe the right thing. It seems like for that to be what the perfect God would do, that would so greatly conflict with my moral intuitions that if that's true, then my intuition that that unfathomable suffering is bad would be in some sense thrown out the window. I think that we can't, it's very difficult to make claims under moral uncertainty. But I think that
I have my own version of Pascal's wager, I think, which works much better than his. My version of Pascal's wager is an argument for moral realism. And the argument is that if moral realism is correct, and you act as if it is correct, you have not done bad things. And the bad things, by definition, are things you're not supposed to, things you shouldn't do. If moral realism is wrong, well, you miss a few pleasurable sins that you could commit, wicked acts you could commit. But most of the time, my moral intuitions are consistent with something not too far from maximizing my happiness anyway. So therefore, I should say that as long as there's any significant probability that moral beliefs are really true, I should act as if they're true. And I think it's better than Pascal's wager because it avoids a bunch of the standard problems with Pascal's wager.
Yeah. In debate, that's actually an argument that gets made quite a bit. There's an argument that people will sometimes make, just sort of the nihilistic argument that morality doesn't exist, give a bunch of reasons really fast as to why it likely doesn't exist, which are hard to respond to when you give a bunch of justifications for nihilism relatively rapidly, especially because justifications for nihilism are generally relatively hard to refute. And then they will make the argument, and then the other person in response will often make the argument that even if nihilism might be true, if there's a chance that it's not, then we should act as if it's not, because if it's not true, then the total level of...
I'm glad to see I'm not the only person who thought up that argument.
Yeah. I think that does apply to nihilism. But so what would you think about the idea that existential threat reduction is a incredibly important good?
I think that we have no good way of knowing what decisions today will increase or decrease existential threat, with rare exceptions. That is, firing nuclear weapons probably increases it, but I'm not even sure it increases it. If you really believe the population alarmists, which as it happens I don't, then you might think that the only way we'll avoid destroying our species through overpopulation is if we have a good thermonuclear war now and get rid of 98%. Maybe by the time the other 2% have gotten back up to our present situation, we'll be... the version of this that I usually offer, which is in the climate case, is that if you look at the calculations that Nordhoff offers for the cost of global warming, first, if you actually look at his numbers, it's a pretty trivial cost, though he never says so. That's a separate issue. But that in order to get those numbers, he has to include low probability, high cost outcomes. He has to include things that he's almost sure won't happen, but if they did happen, would be really terrible. As far as I can tell, he never thought about what are the low probability, high cost, negative effects of preventing global warming. We are, after all, currently in interglacial. We don't have a really good theory of why glaciations come and go. We know quite a lot about what a glaciation is like. It could be that global warming is all that's preventing the end of the current interglacial.
Wait, sorry, what is an interglacial?
Sorry, we're currently in an ice age. We've been in an ice age for about 3 million years. An ice age, as geologists use the term, is a time when there's ice on one or both poles. We're so used to it that we assume that's the normal state of the world, but it isn't actually. Ice ages generally are alternating glaciations and interglacials. You'll have a period of, say, 50,000 years, 100,000 years, varies, in which you have sizable parts of the Earth covered by ice. And then for some reason, and people have theory what the reason is, the ice retreats and you end up with something like the present state of the world where there's still ice caps on the North and South poles, but where most of the Earth is ice-free. And then another glaciation happens. Happened many times. We've got the records got the geological record shows that. And it is possible, low probability, of course, it's possible that it's global warming. I should say that the current interglacial has lasted for a long time. In terms of the historical evidence, it wouldn't be surprising if it ended somewhere around now. It looks as though temperatures have been gradually declining for quite a long time, rising more recently. So it could be that if we didn't have global warming, they'd decline a bit further and the ice would start moving towards the equator and we'd have half a mile of ice over Chicago and London, which is roughly what the situation was in a previous glaciation. And of course, all of that water is going into ice. So at that point, the sea levels drop about 300 feet when you have a glaciation. So every port in the world is high and dry. That's a pretty big catastrophe compared to most of the things that global warming is supposed to produce. And we don't know that it isn't true. So that's one example. But my general point is that I think there's enough uncertainty out there so that it doesn't make sense to have your present decisions hinge on very long-term consequences, even if you think they're large.
Sure. So that seems to be more of a practical problem with existential threat reduction.
Yes.
So if you could spend $1 million and you could guarantee that it would reduce existential threats by 1 in a billion for $1 million, would you do it?
You have to know in order to do that what after the reduction it's going to be. That is to say, Bostrom's calculation depends on everything going well for a very long period of time, better than we have any reason to expect it to. So your idea that existential threat has this astronomical cost depends on the assumption that the alternative is something like what he describes. Whereas if you believe that if we don't reduce this particular existential threat, something else will kill off the human race in 200 years. Now, not such a huge amount. Or something else will limit the size of the human race, which is not implausible. That it turns out, as it might turn out, that space travel is impractical. I think realistically, I think if you really want to get a big population off Earth, you don't do it by going to other planets. You do it by having orbital habitats of one sort or another, orbiting the sun or orbiting the Earth or orbiting other planets. That, as somebody put it a long time ago, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense after climbing out of a well with a great deal of difficulty to jump down into another well, which is what colonizing a planet amounts to. But even given that, it seems to me that if you think the likely future is much, much, much more limited than Nick Bostrom proposes, then the cost of your risk becomes a whole lot, the cost of wiping out humanity becomes a good deal smaller than in your version, and now it's not clear that you should really be willing to pay for a 1 in a billion chance of a billion reduction.
it seems like
But the practical argument is you just never know that you've got it. The practical argument is that these are nice hypotheticals to think about, but in fact, basing arguments on what you should do in the real world on this kind of argument is almost always a mistake, because whatever you propose to do to reduce existential risk, I can respond by thinking up some way it might increase existential risk, and we don't have good tools for dealing with that kind of a problem. So we ought to be spending our time and energy thinking about things in the next 50 years, maybe the next 100 years, but not much beyond that.
Right. I think that so I think that it's true that for every action that could be conceivably proposed to attempt to resolve existential threats, you could think of some way that it increased existential threats.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that I think that you have to weigh up how strong the arguments are, and I think that that's sort of true of anything. So, for example,
right, but it's a hard enough problem if you're talking about the next 10 years. And
right.
It seems to me that to base your decisions on that kind of a thing, where what your conclusion is will depend a whole lot on what result you want to reach, and much less on what the real, in some sense, objective probabilities are. That if you want to argue for reducing population growth because you've got some reason to think that more people are bad, you will then think up reasons to think that population growth is probably a dreadful threat, even though it might be a good thing. If you want to have excuses for taxing carbon production, you will add up your externalities from global warming, making generous estimates for the negative externalities and conservative estimates for the positive externalities, and so forth and so on. So I just don't trust human beings, including me, doing these calculations, and I'd prefer to limit it to things where we come at least a little bit closer to being able to reach a decent answer. Still not very close, but a little bit close.
Right. So it seems to me that for any endeavor, any goal that you try to achieve, you could imagine a way that your attempt to achieve that goal would backfire and have the opposite effect. For example, your attempt to convince people of anarchy, it's possible that you, by making the economics case, will make more people make the economics case.
Could be.
It seems like that's insufficient to say that we cannot have any impact on.
But I think a pretty good rule of thumb is that on the whole, knowing truth is positive. Not always. But as a general rule, the world works better if people know what is true than if they don't. May not be the case when what they know is how to make atomic bombs, but it's usually true. So that as far as I can see, one of my functions in the world is to think up correct ideas and offer them to other people. And if I have an analysis of anarcho-capitalism, nobody is compelled to go along with it. Other people can think about it for themselves, but creating these ideas and trying to figure out their implications and putting them out seems to me, on average, to be likely to be a good thing. Might be a bad thing, don't know, but that's the best we can do. We live in a world of uncertainty. That's the fate we are condemned to.
It seems like with one could make similar heuristics and use those similar heuristics to justify a variety of ways to reduce existential threats. So, for example, reducing the risks of nuclear accidents seems to be a good way of reducing existential threats.
I don't think so. As far as I can say, nuclear accidents, yeah, they might kill 100,000 people. That's not an existential risk. As far as I can tell, the only way you're going to have nuclear things have the effect on the scale you're talking about is deliberate ones. That is, setting it off might not be deliberate, as in the Petrov incident, but somebody has got to have put a whole lot of time and effort into that. Now, biological threats, that might not be true. That I think it is at least not impossible that our ability at things like genetic engineering might reach the point where a smart high school kid could end the world in his basement. I don't think it's likely, but it's not impossible. I think it's a good deal more likely, still very, very unlikely, but a good deal more likely than a nuclear accident would do it.
Sure. So some areas that people have looked at in terms of ways to attempt to reduce existential threats For one, there's been research into AI alignment, doing research into making the way AI work align with the way humans work, so that they don't kill us all. To me, it seems intuitively that AI would be an unlikely existential threat, but with researchers,
I don't agree. If existential means to the human race, it seems to me that's one of the more likely ones.
Right.
When I published my book, Future Imperfect, which deals with a bunch of this stuff, I gave a talk on it at Google. And I started out by saying that I thought that global warming was a pretty wimpy catastrophe. That I had 3 different ways of wiping out the human race faster. And one of the 3 was AI.
Yeah, what I was saying about AI was, to me, just on a purely intuitive level, it does not seem to pose an existential threat. But looking at what people who are experts in AI think, there seems to be a consensus that from a large percentage of them that it's at least a reasonable threat. And I generally tend to trust that more than my intuitions about AI.
Although it's very hard to know what consensus really is, because everything we get is getting filtered in various ways. So I know that there are people who believe that, partly because I was active for a long time on the blog Slate Star Codex, which you may know about, which had, among other things, a bunch of people, as you probably know, the worry about AI risk is one of the things that the rationalist community is concerned about, and Slate Star Codex in some sense developed out of that, although most of the people on it are really not part of that. I'm not, for that matter. So I've seen lots of discussion of the issue, but I don't know how you would figure out, because I'm sure that if you want to not believe in it, you could undoubtedly find, a dozen high-level computer scientist people who don't think it's a threat. And how do you, as an outsider, figure out what the consensus is? I've thought about this issue mostly in the global warming context, because that's the one I usually confront. But it's also true in economics that, as you probably don't remember, back when Obama was pushing for running a very large deficit in order to solve the 2008 problems, he said all economists agree that doing this is the right thing to do. And there was a comment by, I think, Sargent, who got a Nobel Prize for his work in macroeconomics, which is the relevant field, saying that he thought that Obama had been misled. And that was a particular case where, from the standpoint of the ordinary person, reading the New York Times or even the Wall Street Journal, he's much more likely to hear what Obama said than to hear what Sargent said. Although, in fact, Obama is not competent to have an opinion on the subject, and he cannot be trusted to have an opinion on the subject, because it's in his interest to say that what he's doing is good, whether it is or not. Whereas Sargent is both competent and can be trusted. He has no particular axe to grind. He might be wrong. And Sargent didn't say that the stimulus was not the right thing. What he said was that it was not the case that all economists in the field agreed that it was the right thing. So I think it's, unless you really know a field fairly well, and maybe you do in the case of AI, I don't. So that I've been thinking about this issue for quite a long time. As I say, in Future Imperfect was published a noticeable while ago, and I discussed there the concern with AI. But unless you know quite a lot about it, more than I do, you can say there are able people who believe it's a problem and that there are able people who don't believe it's a problem, but reaching your conclusion on the grounds of a claimed consensus, I think, is pretty risky.
Yeah, so in this case, it was a poll of like 1,000 experts in the field of AI chosen. I don't know the exact selection process that would be relevant to looking at whether or not it was a reasonable process. But so it was a poll of them, and
what percentage of them thought that AI was a serious threat?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
What percentage of them agreed with the view of various of the people in the rationalist community and elsewhere that there was a serious threat of a paperclip maximizer or equivalent of an AI that was on the one hand, able enough to more or less take over the world, and would then do terribly destructive things when it did, because its objectives weren't our objectives.
I believe the percentage, I think, was 58% who said AI posed a reasonable risk of posing an existential threat. I don't know.
58% is not a consensus.
Well, 58% is more than half, which
Yeah, it's a
provides...
majority, but a consensus means almost everybody.
Sure.
Right?
So
if somebody tells you, here is this statement, and 42% of the experts say it's wrong, you ought to say, well, it might be wrong.
It might be right or it might be wrong. But
Yeah, right.
I think even if we were fairly certain that it was wrong, even if we were
that's a reason to say it might be right. I agree. The fact that more than half the people in the field, assuming they really have done a good selection, and I also look at exactly how the question was put, which also affects how polls come out. But in principle, I agree that in that kind of situation, you could end up saying, yeah, it may well be the case that. But going on to say it is the case that, it seems to me, doesn't follow unless you have an awful lot more than 50%. And you'd like even then to know more about the incentives in that field to know whether there are reasons why people will agree with it, whether or not it's true.
Right. It seems
look at the whole nuclear winter story. It's reasonably clear, I think, looking back at it, that there was never adequate reason to believe in nuclear winter. There was reason to believe it could conceivably happen, but there was not adequate reason to believe that it would happen. On the other hand, nuclear winter provided a strong argument for avoiding thermonuclear war. Lots of very reasonable people, including lots of scientists, wanted to avoid thermonuclear war. And there was therefore a whole lot of pressure not to say, well, actually, this is probably bogus, but to either support it or keep your mouth shut. And I think that's true in lots of other contexts. So it's, again, not that easy for the outsider to know what's really true.
Right. I think, well, that's true. I think that I would provide evidence that, well, we can't know with certainty the impact of things on existential threats. I think that we could make a claim with reasonably high likelihood that the expected value of research into AI alignment in terms of existential threat reduction is probably positive. Would you agree with that?
Probably, but it might turn out that it is probably positive, but it might turn out that the research has bad effects. It might turn out that the research lets people restrict the development of AI in ways which prevent very desirable changes in AI. All right?
Right. It's clearly a question. There's clearly an uncertainty on the issue, but the claim that you made earlier seemed to be that we can't know that much about things' impacts on existential threats, and so we generally shouldn't.
But distant existential threats. This particular existential threat, I think people who believe in it probably think is within the next century.
Right. I'm not. I don't think that we should worry about existential threats that will become relevant 300 years down the line, because I agree that those aren't especially predictable. I think that things like AI, synthetic biology, nuclear war, potentially global warming.
You worry about, but it's not always clear what policies will reduce it.
Right, but it seems like research into it has a positive expected value.
Right.
And so if our goal is to curtail existential threats, then
one of our goals.
Right. Well, if that's I think that's, from my perspective, that's the primary goal, given that I think that if we look at the death of 1,000 people, that would be bad. But if we look at the deaths of 10 to the power of 52 people, that dwarfs 1,000 by such a great amount. You don't really
mean death, though. You mean non-existence.
Non-existence.
Goes back to my question about total versus average utility.
Right. I think that
most people, in fact, don't feel the way you do. That is to say, take the standard time travel stories. There are very few people who say, well, I can't possibly do time travel, even though I can now have a way of doing it, and I could go back and kill Hitler or whatever I want to do. That'll create a different future. And that means that everybody after the time of my time travel who is born won't be born. My God, I will have killed billions and billions of people. That's not the way people feel about it. you would see that if it, just in terms of fiction, if that was really the natural intuition. So that I think people do in fact make a fairly sharp distinction between killing somebody and changes such that somebody doesn't come into existence.
Yeah, I think that
Maybe they shouldn't, but they do.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I think that our intuitive views about person affecting views, our intuitive views about the value of bringing extra people into the world generally make very little sense and are subject to a host of contradictions. The general intuitive view seems to be that, based just on intuitions, that it is good to, that it's sort of morally neutral, maybe slightly positive, to bring a happy person into the world. But it's sort of it's sort of categorically different from other types of moral claims, such that it would not be worth it. Like if you stole $500 from someone, but then you use that money to have a baby, that would not be moral. And I think counterintuitively that potentially that would be moral, because I forget the name of it, but the non-person affecting, or maybe it is the person. I forget the names of the views in ethics related to the number of people, but I think that it's about maximizing total utility. I think that one problem with the intuitive view is if...
Are you willing to agree with me that the proper definition of zero utility is the suicide point? The point at which if you could painlessly kill yourself, you would.
Yeah.
So therefore, bringing someone into existence who has a thoroughly miserable life, but not quite miserable enough to make him want to kill himself is an unambiguously good thing in your view.
It's an unambiguously slightly good thing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think that the intuitive view seems to be that just regardless of how happy your child is and how much well-being they bring into the world, that's not especially relevant to the consideration of the ethics of having a child. And I don't think that that's true at all. So I think
that's right. I think most people would say that if your circumstances are such that if you have a child, it'll be pretty miserable, the argument for having a child becomes a lot weaker than if your circumstances are such that you can give your child a good life.
Right. But I think that people wouldn't differentiate. I think that the view that a lot of people hold is summarized by the phrase that it's good to make people happy, but it's not good to make happy people. And I don't think that view is logically defensible, because it seems like it would be certainly bad to make a host of unhappy people. If you made people who just...
It's only bad if they're past the suicide point.
Right. If you made a variety of people who live lives of just pure pain and misery, and they died at a young age, or regardless of when they died, their lives were just so horrible, they had a horrible disease such that their life was terrible. I think that bringing those people into existence, if their quality of life is such that a rational, self-interested agent would, at the moment of their birth, commit suicide, I think that from that perspective, it would not be rational to... most people would agree that bringing horribly miserable people who just live lives of complete suffering into existence would be bad. Right. There doesn't seem to be any good reason why bringing unhappy people into the world is a moral bad, but bringing happy people into the world is not a moral good. And it seems that if there is the case, then you get a very strange sort of weird version of Pascal's wager, where if there's a low risk that your child will be utterly miserable, but a high risk that your child will be happy, you oughtn't bring them into the world, because if they're happy, there's no moral gain, but if they're miserable, there's moral loss. And there are a variety of other problems with the intuitive view. I think that that's one area where our moral intuitions completely break down. And I don't trust our moral intuitions to make especially good decisions there, for the same reason that a lot of...
But you do trust your moral intuition that utilitarianism is right. You're willing to steal for it. You've just told me so.
I would be willing to steal for it. I think that I think that it's less of sort of, I think that we can make, I think that we're better at making moral theories, just sort of forming the basis of moral theories, than we are at evaluating complex moral questions.
Yes. The way I would put it is that our moral perceptions are perceiving a moral reality, and our moral theories are trying to build a structure on top of those perceptions. And it isn't surprising that different people build very different structures, just as our physical perceptions are perceiving a physical reality, and that in fact people in 1000 AD and at present all saw the sun rise, but the structure that the people at 1000 AD saw was Earth on the center of a set of nested spheres carrying around the moon and the sun and the planets, the Ptolemaic system, whereas the picture that the modern person sees is the sun's at the center and we're orbiting and all the rest, the more or less Newtonian modern system. So similarly, it seems to me not surprising that people's moral theories vary a lot, but that if you actually fully describe a situation, most people will have the same reaction of that person acted correctly or incorrectly.
Well,
we're getting close to my dinner time, so you may want to think about how you want to sort of gradually fade this off.
All right, last subject. So there's an ethical. So I've become convinced that not eating animals is ethically obligatory. I think
so
that
you're that's interesting. So your view with regard to animals is very different from your view with regard to humans. If we didn't eat cattle, there'd be many fewer cattle. They don't just happen to come into existence by accident. So if you believe that having more humans, as long as they're not utterly miserable, is a good thing, then you ought to believe that having more cattle or more chickens or more pigs is a good thing as long as they're not utterly miserable. And therefore, as long as the factory farms aren't too bad, you ought to say you're all that vegetarianism is just a terrible idea, because the result of vegetarianism is that there are fewer animals out there, and that makes reduces the total of human-animal happiness.
Well, I think that they are utterly miserable. I think that if you look at the conditions on factory farms, they are sufficiently bad that I think that it would be better never.
You can choose, if you want to eat meat, you can choose to only eat meat that is sourced from non-factory farms. And that increases the number of animals in those farms while having no effect on the number of animals in other farms.
Right.
Even slightly decrease the number of animals in other farms, because after all, the fact that there are animals that you are eating means there's a slightly higher demand for animal feed to feed them, and that means the price of animal feed will be a little bit higher, and that means that the profit maximizing number of factory farm animals will be a tiny bit lower. So you're actually doing benefit in terms of fat. But if you were a vegetarian, that's just horrible from this standpoint.
Well, but surely I think that the effect on factory farms, it seems like it would probably on net go the other way, because if you consume more non-factory farm meat, then that slightly raises the price of non-factory farm meat, such that other people are probably more likely to substitute for factory farm.
But it also means by raising the price that the amount of non-factory farm meat will increase. But it's true. My working assumption is that you probably have a pretty flat supply curve, because the non-factory farm meat is a very small part of the industry, and therefore my guess is that doubling its size given a little bit of time won't actually raise the cost. But I could be wrong. I don't know. But in any case, I'm only suggesting that the obvious implication of your arguments is against vegetarianism, not for it. Now, I should say, I have a question for you, and that is that I noticed that the identity you go under is deity defeater. And the question is, how do you go about defeating a deity?
It's a funny question. The reason for that moniker was I want to appeal to the edgy teenage atheist crowd, because I think that's where the market for YouTube videos about why God likely doesn't exist. It's where the market truly lies. My arguments against the existence of God, I have a Google Doc where I have a variety of them. I
Well, I came
find
up with an argument when I was about 9, which I thought was a proof that it was more likely that God didn't exist than that he did. But I eventually concluded it was wrong.
out of curiosity, what was that argument?
Oh, the argument was Pascal's wager. The argument was that uh, a universe with a God includes the rest of the universe. So if you keep the universe and remove the God, then you have a simpler picture. And if you accept not Pascal's wager, I'm sorry. What's the name I want? The principle that you should prefer simpler hypotheses.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Somebody's principle.
Yeah. What's it called?
Doesn't matter. I block on names much too much, even more as I get older. But I've always had that problem. But in any case, you know the principle.
Occam's razor.
What? Occam's razor, exactly. Occam's razor. So Occam's razor then suggests that the world without the God is simpler than the world with the God, therefore is more likely. And when I thought about it more, I realized that was a poor argument. It's a poor argument first because it might be that the world plus God, the rest of the world depends on God's existence to be a consistent story. So it might be that if you remove God and leave everything else the same, you no longer have a possible world, so therefore you don't really have it. It might turn out that the world without God, in order to be internally consistent without God to explain some things, could be more complicated. And second, it's not really clear that Occam's razor can be used to evaluate the probability of the nature of the universe. So I concluded. I should say I think that was the first time I discussed the question of religion with my parents, and I told my father I concluded that God probably didn't exist, and he said that was his opinion as well. But at this point, although I still hold the same opinion, I don't think I've got a proof of it.
Yeah, I think so. My arguments against God, just to go through them rapidly, the ones that I find persuasive. There's a problem called the problem of maximization, which is that whatever goal, if an omnipotent being has a certain goal, you would expect that goal to be actualized. But the fact that according to every major religion, God wants many things that he does not achieve, such as God wants you to choose him, but then he does not achieve that, I think serves.
He wants, these are much too simple, given that you don't really know much about what a God would be like not being one. And that it might well be that what God wants is you to choose him, but in order for choosing him to be valuable, you have to have free will. And part of the implication of free will is that God is not able to control your choices. This goes back to the old line, can God make a rock so heavy he can't lift it if he's omnipotent? And the answer is that omnipotent does not mean you can do logically inconsistent things. And similarly,
right. Yeah, I have a response to that.
Just to quickly, it may be difficult, but you actually need to find a smart theist to argue with. Maybe you've succeeded in doing that. But I bet that I could do, even though I'm an atheist, I bet that I could do an adequate job of showing that any of your very strong arguments have problems with them.
Yeah, the second argument is the problem of evil. I think the way I make it, it's not really the problem of evil, it's the problem of bad design. If the world were made by a perfect being, you would expect it generally to be designed reasonably well.
You know about H.L. Mencken's version of this?
About whose version?
Mencken says that the argument for design says we were designed by a omniscient and benevolent and all-powerful God. And that's inconsistent with the human knee. That if you actually look at human beings, parts of them are beautifully designed. And the hand is a really impressive piece of engineering. But then, the knee is just a pain, and there are various other things. What do we have an appendix for, and so forth? And so Mencken says the obvious conclusion is that the universe was created not by an omnipotent and omniscient God, but by a committee of omnipotent and omniscient gods. And as soon as any one of them got something right, the rest had to improve it.
Yeah.
Do you read Mencken?
Yeah, this argument is a little bit different. It's not the argument of just sort of bad. It's not like Dawkins's argument of like the way the human appendix or human and other animals' limbs are designed. They're just not very effective at achieving goals. They're not perfect designs. The argument is more that from a normative perspective, the way that things are designed is not the best way to design them. For example, there's some.
But that assumes you know the best way to design them. And you ought, if you look at sort of human history, to realize that people have very, very often thought they knew the best way of doing things and it turned out to be a catastrophe. That Lenin knew the best way of designing a society. And he
Right.
killed many millions of people as a result. He and his
Sure.
successors.
Well, we can't know with certainty mortal claims. I think it's pretty clear that something like malaria is bad, and even if there's some justification for it, the existence of so many things that seem to be bad, if each of them is a thing that cannot be explained at
Once you admit the possibility that a religion is right, you then have the possibility of personal immortality, and you can then take the same kind of argument you were making in a different context and say, look, turning out to be a virtuous, holy person for the next 10 million years is a whole lot more important than whether you die unpleasantly of malaria at 25. And it may turn out that the best way of putting people in an environment which will result in their making the free will choices that develop them into the kind of person you want happens to have these costs. Have you ever read C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce?
I have not.
You might enjoy it because Lewis has a picture of hell in which there isn't any torture. People are in hell because, in a certain sense, because they want to be. They're in hell because they are not willing to accept God. And he describes Napoleon in hell. And Napoleon is in a beautiful palace, everything gold-plated. And he's sitting there in a room saying to himself, it was Ney's fault. It was Soult's fault. Those are two of his marshals, as you may know. And basically, what Lewis is conjecturing there, I don't think he believes that he knows this is true, but he's offering a piece of fiction on a religious subject, is that it's basically the characteristics of yourself, the choices you make, that put you in hell. And in his version, people in hell can go take an excursion to heaven. They can get in a bus. But the grass in heaven cuts their feet because it's too real. And that presumably is a metaphor for the fact that in heaven you have to believe what is, not what you want to believe. And Napoleon really wants to believe that it was Soult's fault and Ney's fault. So you might want to read it. It's in general, it's worth reading things by smart theists. My two favorites are C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton. Now, Chesterton was also a libertarian, a slightly nutty libertarian, but a brilliant writer. Have you ever read any Chesterton?
I have not.
All right. I would recommend, sometimes he's wrong, but he nonetheless does a pretty good job, I think, of giving you a picture of how an intelligent person can actually believe these things. He ends up as a Catholic. Lewis is, I think, an Anglican of some sort. So I think, I'm an atheist, but I'm not on the whole an admirer of the sort of atheist movement. I think it tends, like many other things, to be too arrogant about how obvious it is that its version is right. If you like, I'm currently in the process of turning 15 years of blog posts into one or more books, and I'm early on in it. But I have written a few chapters on religion, which include my response to some of the atheist arguments that I've seen people making. And if you like, I'll be happy to send you those drafts and see if they convince you of anything.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. To very quickly, because I know you have to go over their arguments, that as to why I'm not persuaded that a God exists. I think that there. So I think
why
that,
you are persuaded that a God does not exist. That's a stronger
right.
statement than not.
Yeah, that I am persuaded that a God does not exist.
Yep.
I think that hell seems to be quite a appalling doctrine.
And not all versions of religion have hell in the sort of form of torture. And I think that Lewis's view, at least in that book, is that that's just a metaphor for the fact that the choice to be separate from God is ultimately horrible, but it's still a choice you're making at every moment.
Right. This argument is only an argument that I raise against people who subscribe to the doctrine of hell. Another argument is the argument from concealment, which is if there's a God who wants us to know that he exists, Why doesn't he reveal himself? I think that this is also a problem, not only of the fact that God has revealed or hasn't revealed himself, but the problem of sort of inconsistent concealment. It seems strange that God would reveal himself, would have inconsistent revelations to different people at different times, that whether he reveals himself to someone is largely contingent on where they were raised and how convinced they are by the Kalam cosmological argument. That doesn't seem to be a great basis for convincing people of his existence. The next argument is the argument from moral uncertainty, which is that if God made it so that we know right from wrong, and that he wrote a moral law on our hearts, as many religious people say, then why does the moral law that's written on our hearts, why do our moral intuitions have so many contradictions and have so many errors? This is an argument that I thought of myself. I think it's an interesting problem for the theistic account. And then the last argument, that this one I did not think of. I obviously did not think of the problem of evil. The only two that I
could have thought it up for yourself. The fact that someone else thought it up first doesn't prove that you didn't. I think there are one or two of the articles I've written where somebody, in fact, there's one of my articles where Ronald Coase stole my idea, but he stole it about 20 or 30 years before I had it.
Yeah, I think it's hard to remember because I had the idea at a pretty young age, but I think I originally came up with the problem of evil without having heard it from someone else. Who knows? So the last argument is an argument written by thought of by the physicist Sean Carroll, which has been made in somewhat other forms by other people, which is the problem of instruction, which is that if God was making a book of revelation and sending it down to people on Earth, you would expect it to contain some deep wisdom and be generally well written. And if you look at the Bible, you see a mess of
so then you've got to be a Muslim instead, because at least I don't read Arabic, but I'm told that the Quran is magnificent poetry, very well written.
Right. But you would expect it to contain some. For example, if in the Bible it had just outlined comprehensively the germ theory of disease and why one ought to wash their hands, that would have saved millions of lives, or potentially billions.
Why does saving lives matter if you're God? I mean, it's not like people die permanently after all. You're just assuming your view of the world.
So, to the extent that one holds to the position that saving lives does not matter, then there would be no ethical reason to, for example, help disease prevention programs to prevent.
There might be reasons why you should do it. That after all, if what God wants is for you to act virtuously, and virtuous act for you has to be in the context of your knowledge, not of his knowledge, that even if he knows that what you're doing is ultimately pointless, that doesn't mean you do. And maybe what he wants is for you to develop into a virtuous being, and maybe eventually he'll have a better. It just seems to me that almost all of these arguments, one can think about ways why they could be wrong. And the obvious counter argument to all of them is just, how good a job do you think a squirrel could do of figuring out why you do things?
Right. My common response to that is that the reason why a squirrel would be unable to figure out why we do things is because we face certain constraints and we have certain goals, and resolving those goals requires doing strange things that are very different from what a squirrel does. But for an omnipotent God, there are no constraints on them. They don't need to.
That isn't right. There's still the constraint of logical consistency. Even an omnipotent God doesn't make 2 + 2 = 5. And so if the God has objectives, which you probably don't understand, there may be all sorts of constraints in how he's got to organize the world in order to achieve those objectives.
Right.
But
I think
at this point it's past 6 and I can smell dinner.
Just last sentence. I think that to the extent that one is convinced by that argument, then that also would sort of negate all the arguments for God. Because if you're convinced that you can make no predictions about what a God would do, then you cannot make a prediction that God would fine-tune the universe, or that God would catalyze the beginning of the universe, or that God would
But,
be the
but
source
my
of
claim
now.
is not that you can make no predictions, but you can make no predictions with high confidence, just as my view and a bunch of other things are. So that you might say that a different person who believes in God thinks he's got a consistent story, which suggests that God probably does exist and will do the fine thing. But of course, he could be wrong. But anyway, this was fun. I enjoyed it. I hope your viewers enjoy the conversation. But I think at this point, it's about time for me to
All right.
terminate. I hope you will send me a URL of this so that I can put it up on my webpage so people are interested to watch.
All right. I shall. Good chatting.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.